Next week marks the 100th episode of this Business Emergency Room podcast. And as I've been reflecting on nearly 2 years of conversations, one theme keeps coming up. Businesses rarely wake up one morning and discover they're in trouble. More often, they slowly lose momentum. The growth flattens, the energy changes, and the signals from the market become harder to hear. And by the time the numbers really show the problem, the underlying causes have often been there for months or even years. Today's conversation is about one of those hidden symptoms: stagnation, strategic drift, the slow loss of innovation and energy that can quietly erode value long before anyone calls it a crisis. My guest is Noel Daly, and while we start by talking about innovation, what we're really discussing is how leaders keep organizations learning, adapting, and moving before they find themselves needing emergency intervention. Leadership today isn't just about scaling. It's about navigating constant uncertainty, market disruptions, and high-pressure decisions. If you're dealing with chaos, bottlenecks, and relentless pressure, welcome to the Business Emergency Room. Hey, thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Business Emergency Room. I'm glad you're here. My guest today is Noel Daly. He's an entrepreneur and an inventor and an author who has founded and developed ventures across multiple industries, including medical technology, advanced materials, and other innovation-driven enterprises. Over the course of his career, he's built companies, he's developed intellectual property, and worked internationally with founders and innovators and investors. Patrick, welcome to the Business Emergency Room.
Thank you, Maartje. Great to be here.
Yeah, and you're Irish, I'm Dutch. You've lived in the Netherlands, right? We could really start this conversation complaining about the weather, but that's maybe not the best use of our time. Let's get into the subject matter at hand. We are going to talk about the value of innovation and the perpetual need for innovation on all fronts. We are, I would say, both believers in that space. So can you talk a little bit about where for you that idea came from, that innovation is something that's perpetual and that should exist not just maybe in your product or but also in the rest of your organization or in the way you do business?
Yeah, sure. Innovation is really important for me. I was asked that question actually not too long ago, a few weeks ago. And I said innovation in a business, but also in the individual, is a mindset. You know, you're looking for ways to improve. There has to be an easier way to do this. That'll probably be my epitaph. There must be an easier way to do this. You know, it'll be something that I always look at something and say, okay, can we improve on that? Can we develop it? And I think the misconception is that innovation is driven around a product or a service. But if you go into a business, and if we look at businesses every day and we assess businesses and we review businesses and we advise businesses, I will look at the innovation factor across the entire business. It doesn't have to be in the R&D department. It can be in the accounting department. What are you doing to innovate? What are you doing to change? What are you doing to improve? To make that machine run more smoothly through innovation. So I see it as one of the fundamental foundation stones of a business, the innovation mindset.
Yeah, and I've worked a lot in change management, right? And people always talk about this continuous improvement. And improvement is such a loaded term because people kind of get irked by the idea because that it basically suggests that the way you're currently doing it is wrong, right? Mm-hmm. Because you need to improve it, which is not really the case, right? So I really like that you talk about innovation in that space. I also don't think it's necessarily entirely the same as improvement, because improvement to me at times feels like small scale. Innovation is thinking bigger.
Yes.
Am I? Yeah.
It has probably multi-levels. Like you can go at the local, let's say just an extra millimeter change, and that can be classified as innovation too, I think. And what I like to do is in my businesses when I'm building them is to give somebody a pat on the back and say, that's a great idea. Or you've improved it. You've saved your day by, you've taken 30 minutes of inefficiency out of your day. That's an improvement. So the improvement and the innovation, I think if you tie both of them together, you probably get better value for improvement by calling it innovation.
from where you sit, if you look at some of the businesses that you've worked with, the ones that did well and the ones that didn't do so well, what are some of the symptoms of an organization or a team that has simply maybe better DNA or to be innovative? What are some of the symptoms that they maybe, because of either the way they're set up or the way that for you can tell when you come in, this is an easier platform to innovate from than what I'm seeing on the other side of the table?
Yeah, great question. Leadership, first of all, and the vision for the business. From the right across the business, from the top to every level, that there's a clear vision for where you need to go. In my businesses, when I founded businesses, I would make sure that everybody in the team knew exactly what our roadmap should be. And that's by consultation with them. I don't go up into my office and just draft out a roadmap and say, this is where we're going to be in 3 years' time, even though that's helpful. And that's something that the leader or the founder needs to do. But having that democratic kind of input as well from the team and then making that roadmap, it's the leader's job then, or the founder's job, to create that vision. That's the first thing. So vision is very, very important. Obviously, the roadmap, knowing what your plan is. And that doesn't have to be like a 100-page business plan. That can be an outline of where you need to be in a year from now, in 6 months from now, a year from now, 3 years from now. And then the other aspect is communication between people within that team and to the outer world. If a business communicates well within its structure, i.e. its people, and if it communicates well to the outer world, it's putting out its brand properly. And I think that understanding of that's the essence of branding. When you understand, when you hear a brand, you associate a character or a personality with that brand. Now it's let's say the founder's job or the leader's job to make sure that brand aligns with the messaging that's going out and vice versa.
So if I translate it here in the business emergency room, right, I compare an organization often to a human body, and what the way you're explaining it makes me immediately think around words like self-aware. So self-aware in a way that you know how you come across in your market, and you play that game, right? So you see how people then react to you and put yourself out there. So there's some level of self-awareness, but also internally that communication is around some self-regulation, right? And not ignoring the external signs that what your organization and your body is trying to tell you. So that indicates a certain level of transparency in the way the communication happens internally.
Yeah, absolutely. And the outward-facing people typically are the conduits for that information. So if you have a sales team, for example, I would always have a regular call with my salespeople on a Friday, and I would say, tell me what's going on. What's the finger on the pulse? I need to understand what's in the market. Because sometimes, and I found as well, that some people are very mechanical about that information. They go, oh, I had like 50 calls this week, and 10 of them turned into quality, 5 of them will turn into sales, etc. But I'm saying, tell me what the story from the market between the lines. I want to hear the story on the market. I want to hear what's happening. I want to hear, like I said, a finger on the pulse. Who's moving where? Who's bought who? What's our competition doing? Where are they at? Where are we at relative to them? What's the perception of us in the market? What does our customer first think of when they hear, PND Inc., for example? What exactly is the transmission of message that we're putting out there? And understanding, I think, the movements in the market and knowing what that kind of vibe is in the market is very, very important from a business development point of view, because sometimes those gaps create innovation. If we're selling product A and product B, and they're saying, the feedback to me is, well, we need to tweak this or we need to tweak that. We can create product C by evolution of that thinking, where we're gathering information on the market. And I've always been, the inventions that I've personally made, I've talked to customers, end users of the product. And I'll ask the questions, I listen to what they're saying on the lines, but I listen to also the opportunity between the lines. They may not articulate particularly to me that they want a product to do X and Y, but they will say, well, we're buying this product and here's a shortfall. Here's where it's not good. And that typically generates for me the opportunity for something that can solve that. So it's all tied together.
And innovation is, to me, innovation, I always say innovation comes from the dialogue and from the co-creation, right? And the example you're giving of the leader going out and ask these questions, it's about asking the stuff that's not in a report. And you can say, well, I want you at the bottom of the report to summarize the other stuff that's not in the numbers, but it doesn't have the same effect, because then stuff gets lost in translation, and the real juicy tidbits that might make your brain work might not make it out there, because somebody is going to write down so much less than what you're going to get in terms of the fruit that you pick out of a dialogue with somebody.
Absolutely. And I don't necessarily want to see the sales report from the sales reporting perspective, but I also want to have the chat. I need to have that discussion, and that's going to be that could be a phone call. It's most likely going to be a Zoom call or face-to-face meeting, because I don't think you can gather as much information unless you're visually, like, sitting across the table, or you're on a Zoom call with somebody, because it's the kind of movement of the conversation and assessing that, or catching that opportunity, or catching that message is very important.
Yeah, and I think the side effect is that feeds your culture of transparency, right? Because if you go out and speak to people, and even if you talk to somebody different every week, right, you might not pick the same salesperson or whatever, or however you work that's a massive and such a valuable signal to that individual, saying, hey, this guy wants to know. So if they then run into something else, they're like, I bet they might be interested in that. And you stand a chance that these signals actually make it through, huh?
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing about it is, if an innovation does come from this, or if an idea, or if a new way of doing things comes from a conversation, you give them the credit afterwards, because, you can say, I had a chat with Joe or Josephine, and they gave me this idea and they gave me this suggestion. And now 3 months later, we have a solution, or we have a new product, or we have a new service because of that conversation. So acknowledging their input is very, very important as well, because, no person is an island. We all need people to get things done. I think that's probably the most fundamental part of a business, actually, if you get the people right. The people formula is very, very important. And getting that team and getting that engagement and that correspondence, communication, but everybody smiling in the same direction. Let's put it like that. Everybody is enthusiastic and wanting to win and wanting to achieve what the business needs and what they individually need as well.
Can we take this thinking to a slightly different scenario? You and I have talked about this. We both see a lot of businesses that are innovation-based businesses, right, in their core product and services, and that then grow to a certain level, and very many of them sort of plateau somewhat. The innovation doesn't keep going at the same pace, and they're also a little bit like, well, this is now the point where we kind of envisioned an exit. So do we grow through, or it's kind of an inflection point? And we were talking about how in that scenario, you don't necessarily, or you don't do your business justice by kind of going in a whole pattern, trying to sell your business whilst it's no longer really in motion, right? And you have quite strong ideas about that. So can we talk about why that is actually detrimental to your business if you're trying to exit or sell or put it out in the market, if at that plateau where you're kind of more hanging?
I think if you get to that plateau point, you've probably missed the boat in terms of your real value, because the time to want to sell your business is when you're at that point, but when you're like well before it. That's when you're cruising up that steep curve and growing. That's when you'll get the offers from other acquirers or potential acquirers. And saying no in that period is probably a difficult thing to do, but it's a very fine formula between maximizing value and cashing in at the right time, and not too early, for example. Timing is critical. So a business life cycle has certain value points depending on what you're doing. But if you are going on a certain path, and this is your roadmap and this is your plan, and you're achieving your plan, and let's say you're still on the upward climb, not at the plateau, that's maybe usually a very good time to sell, because your value is at its highest. If the potential acquirer senses that you're at plateau, that you've flatlined, that you're not growing, then the price ticket goes down, because they're saying, okay, it's now a buyer's market, not a seller's market. I would say, though, that businesses typically, in my experience, if they're at plateau or if they're at a flat energy level, they can be re-energized. Like by maybe changing not necessarily changing the plan. The business has its fundamentals, but tweaking maybe a people selection, tweaking the innovation selection, putting new life into the business. Maybe look at a different market segment, adding some sales. So if you get to a point, let's take a time point. Let's say 3 years down the road, you've had a startup, it's done really well, and you're at a value point. Are you seeing it flatlining? You're seeing it get to a point where it's actually just not growing. If you can regenerate that growth again and keep it for another year, then that's your time point to look at. And if your strategy is to exit, to sell your business, make sure you're doing that when you're on the upward climb, is my advice. I would always do that. Selling something when it's plateauing, typically not a very good thing for the seller.
Yeah, so let's talk about that in a little more depth then, because innovation constitutes value, right? One of the reasons I wanted to have this conversation is that innovation failure rarely looks like a crisis. It usually looks like a company that's still functioning. It's still selling, it's still delivering. It's just slowly losing its momentum, its ability to keep pace with the market. And by the time that becomes obvious in the numbers, the real problem has often been developing for years. And that's how an outsider and an insider, I think, should look at a business that's what's driving your value and your value generation and your value growth. And people are very much a factor in that, right? So then that basically means that the energy of those people, right, directly impacts that value too. And so you started alluding to maybe change out some of the resources or put some fresh injection of that in there, which is, then linked back to energy. So let's talk about the case we were talking about. If you would, you get 5 days with what with a company that's at that plateau in a a sort of more typical startup company that's done really well, and or it's no longer a startup, right? It's a commercial organization, B2B space, but they really had their really big main product, and that seems to be kind of going well, and they didn't make an exit. So now they're at this point. What are some of the main, if you would be the doctor in the business emergency room there, what are some of the main things you start conversations about or that you would focus on, assuming that they're a somewhat healthy organization, right? There's not all sorts of other extreme circumstances there.
Well, I think that's the first question. Make sure that everything is absolutely proper and correct. So I want to see numbers, I want to see trends, I want to see the reports, and I look into the mechanics of the numbers first of all. Then I will have conversations, not in groups, on one-to-one basis, where I'll go and talk to people. And I'll just randomly pick up the phone. It's not like a pre-rehearsed answer opportunity. I want to get to the information, and I want to ask questions directly. And I want to know from the sales team, from the R&D team, from the product related, from the accounting people. I want to speak to the people that are in the machine every day and keeping that machine running. And I'll ask pretty straightforward questions. This is where it's at. Why did this stop? Why did that slow down? Why did that go flat? Why did our sales curve and that just go flat? What's your view? When all that information is collected, maybe say that's 2 days of my 5 days. There's 1 day in the middle that I will take, and I'll take all of that information and I'll sit myself and look at it and say, right, these are the possibilities. On day 4, I'll come back and I'll suggest it to the people within the machine. These are possible solutions. What do you think? Get their feedback, get their ideas. A lot of the time, when you come in from the outside to look at something, you have much bigger, much bigger view, much bigger glasses on. You can see things that the people in the machine every day cannot see, and that's the value of
fresh eyes.
In. Yeah, and then on day 5, I'll pitch it, and I'll go to the leadership of the business, to everybody that I've spoken with. Pretty much everybody in the business. Now, if it's a 2,000 person organization, you can't do that. But the key decision makers are key drivers of new energy. They are my target audience because I want to get new energy into that business. And by doing that, it should be done on the basis of strategic decision making at the top. What is their plan? Do they want to license their technologies down the road? Do they want to exit cleanly and take a check? Do they want to grow the business to a unicorn level? Whatever, what the strategic big picture is, and fit your plan and your suggestions and your action points going forward to that overall strategic decision. But having gotten to know and got to understand what the mechanics of don't want to call it a problem, let's say the blockage is, and unblock the blockage by creating new sales.
Yeah, and that sounds very similar as to my triage or diagnostics approach. I love that you start with, when I say, oh yeah, assume that there's nothing else major wrong. It's so, I wouldn't say I am cynical, but I don't necessarily come in with that. But I do very much like you do some checking, right? Because even when people say, oh, this is fine and this is fine, some organizations are also suffering a little bit from death by 1,000 paper cuts, huh? Yes. And I'm not there to fix 1,000 paper cuts, but if there is just a fundamental level of a lot of little things that are, it's like a messy house, right? That is a problem. And that makes also a difference in what I would propose is possible in the moment, right? And that maybe some of the energy should go into just cleaning up, doing a bit of housekeeping, trying to at least make some progress in that, because that's just the energy drain then at times.
Absolutely. Or just making sure that the person or the people matches the task. Like sometimes that's not always aligned. You have certain people doing certain jobs that's the 1,000 paper cuts. You've got somebody who's in a role that may not be ideal for that role. I've been in situations, and I've prescribed in businesses where people go from job A to job B within the same organization, and they perform really, really well in job B, whereas they might have been at 60% output or causing blockages in job A. So moving people around and knowing what I very much am focused on the people aspect. If the people are right, I've said this many times before, but if you have, let's say, an excellent product with a team that isn't entirely at its max level, you're going to do okay. If you have a mediocre product with an excellent team, your chances of success are magnified significantly.
Oh yeah,
because it's about the people around it, and it's the people energy. I call it the internal smile. If they have an internal smile, then they have that enthusiasm, that energy, and that beam, which represents your business and your product or service.
Yeah, and it makes me smile a little, because I think in the AI space, that's the challenge, right? What you would advise and the course you would propose is also dependent on kind of the feedback you're getting from leadership saying, well, high level, this is where we want to go. And so it needs to fit with that, right? You're not going to propose something that's entirely in a different direction.
Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can. Yeah. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. To say, right. Hey, maybe you're on the wrong road here. Maybe you just need, or stay on that road, but choose a new road in tandem with that. Yeah. Yes,
exactly. That was exactly where my next question was going. So, Patrick, if you're in those situations and you're like, hey, there's more possible, and maybe they are not too conservative, or how do you translate that innovation conversation? And I'm asking you this because there's a fair amount of listeners here who are maybe board members or who are investors or who are advisors. So they're more on the sideline and they might see some of this. What do you do to or how do you breach that subject, or how do you convince typically in those scenarios people to maybe take bigger strides than they feel ready for, a bigger leap?
It's the, I guess, IQ and EQ factor combined, where I'll come in and I'll say, okay, the IQ part is, if we did it, I suggest that you look at, you're doing A, I suggest you do B and maybe C. That will cost X amount, and that's the IQ factor. That's the business numbers. The EQ factor is, I come in and say, well, my suggestion is this. You make the decisions, but my suggestion is this. If I was putting my checkbook on the table and investing in this business, I would do this. But you're entirely the decision maker here. So I'm not telling people what to do. I'm suggesting that there are ways to improve their business. And I think any leader even for me, when I was the CEO of my own businesses, right now I've licensed out my technologies, so I'm not actually an operating full-time CEO. But when I was CEO, I would welcome that discussion as long as it's succinct and knowledgeable. I don't want to hear fluff. I don't want to hear. I'm a busy person when you're running an operation, when you're running a CEO. Extremely busy people. They're smart people. In that role, they have to be. So you don't want to waste their time, and you don't want to misdirect them with fluff. You want to come in and say, these are the facts, these are the numbers, this is the opportunity that I've seen. You have option A and B on that. Entirely your call. But this is the information in a succinct, clear, legible format. And usually those people, they'll take it away for a while and look at it. I'll maybe think, okay, well, they took my information. I got my consulting or advisory check. It's all good. And then I'll get a call 2-3 weeks later and they'll say, I thought about what you said and we're going to do this and this. Sometimes I'll hover around and act as a kind of an outside advisor on the growth of that project. Could be a few hours a month, but I guess when you see that I'm adding value, because I think that's the fundamental thing. I'm never going to go into any situation unless I can add value. If I'm offered a project and if I think I can add zero value, I'm just going to say that right from the outset. I'm not going to waste your time or mine. I'm not taking thank you, but no thanks.
No, exactly right.
And I'll take on the businesses and the reviews and the advisory roles that I think I can add value on.
Yeah, and I think that I've talked about that on this podcast before too, right? There's the misconception that maybe it's more true for the big consulting houses, but that we're there to max on hours. But it's also our reputation on the line. If we're not the right person to help you, we will say no, right? And we will refer you to each other or somebody else who's a better fit or is more relevant experience or capacity to work in that space, because there's nothing worse than me trying to help you when I'm really not the wrong person, right? Absolutely. And if it's a first aid situation and the only one there, I will do whatever I can. But if there is other options available, that will happen, right? And I think the important thing, what I heard you say, is that offering up an alternative solution and offering it up from the I perspective, right? And talking somebody through the logic. I've also had people say, well, I brought up these suggestions and they're not listening to me. And I'm like, well, what did you bring up? And I said, well, I just told them that their competitor is doing this. I said, did you know anything about what the competitor or how they're, because safe to say, then you're basically, that's patronizing, right? That's kind of telling somebody, are you keeping on top of your, that's not a value adds alternative. So if you want to open up that conversation, you need to put some work in to say, I've been thinking more about this direction and because A, B, and C. And I'm not saying that if you're the board member or the investor, you need to do a similar amount of work, but if you want to bring up an alternative for discussion, you need to do some homework to present it, huh?
Yeah, and there's also the aspect, I mentioned the EQ aspect as well. Some people, even in leadership roles, they might be emotionally attached to a certain product or a business line or a business segment. And you have to recognize that as well. Somebody might have just created the business from a certain product or service. And under no circumstances from that. They're stuck in that mode. So I think instead of just banging the table and going, these are the options, you have to, let's say, push that one slowly by degrees, into the mindset, into their minds. Because if you go in and say, oh, well, this is a waste of time, then they're just going to shut down immediately. And you might think, okay, that people might listen to this and they might say, well, isn't that just logical? And isn't that just common sense? Well, the saying goes, common sense isn't always very common, So, and
no, and if you're
just putting suggestions in front of people, and I'm not saying that that I come in with a script that is 100% correct. This is the assessment that I've taken from the market and with my experience, with my inputs, and I'll base it with as much external information as possible. So I'll come in and I'll say, if you went down this road and if you take this new segment or this new product line, I think it would succeed because I spoke with the CEO of a potential customer company and this was their feedback. So giving that kind of like validity or validation from the external market to the operating CEO that you might be reporting to or making a report for is very valid. It's not just my opinion then. I've actually assessed this in the market on a kind of a very precursor basis. I've spoken to an operating CEO that could become your business or could become your customer. And they said they would buy this service if it was available at X price, whatever. Give as much granular detail as possible.
And that brings us back to the fundamentals of decision making, right? Because what I always talk about is that you need to mature the various options to a similar level of definition. Otherwise, you will always stick with the one that's most defined. So basically, what you're doing is putting another option on the table, and the only way that will work, maybe not if it's entirely at the same level of definition, but at least it needs to have a level of definition so that people can start thinking about it. Exactly. And it's no longer this morb blob. I know for a fact, because we both have lots of energy around this space, we could keep going for a gazillion years on this. To round off to finish off this conversation, Patrick, could you think of something for the listeners? If I want to go back into my team or organization tomorrow and every day after, what's kind of the question I should ask myself to do a bit of a check or get in the right mindset to keep innovation and an innovative mindset front and center? What's kind of is there a good question I can ask myself or a...
Yeah, I think the key for me is, do I have a fully functioning conduit to the market through my team? Do I know, is that pipeline of information fluid, and is it running at full pressure? Am I getting as much information as I can? Because we as operators, CEOs, heads of businesses, information is power, and we need information. So that's the fundamental question. Is my internal team, my internal machine giving me as much information as I can so I can have my finger on the pulse in the market?
Full conduit. Well, that's a nice, perfect way to bring it full circle, right? And that's value and innovation and energy all in one. Patrick, if people after listening here want to get in touch with you or find out more about you or your book, etc., where do they go? What do they do?
They can either email me directly at pnd@patricknoeldaly.com, or you can go onto my website, which is pndforgood.com, pndforgood.com.
Okay. And Noel is with one L and Daly is Daly.
That's right. Noeldaly. So Patrick Noel Daly, pnd@patricknoeldaly.com.
One thing that struck me in this conversation is that businesses don't usually run out of opportunity. More often, they run out of curiosity. They stop listening closely to customers. They lose momentum. They stop challenging assumptions, and they stop looking for ways to evolve. Or maybe they just get caught up in dealing with what's on our plates today. If you're seeing signs of stagnation, flatlining growth, or are simply wondering whether you're hearing the right signals from the market and whether you still have the right speed and energy to keep up with what that market is telling you, well, that's exactly the kind of diagnostic work I help organizations with through the Chaos Games Consulting. Sometimes the problem isn't that the business is broken. Sometimes the problem is that the business has stopped learning and evolving and lost some of its innovative momentum. Well, thank you for joining me on the Business Emergency Room podcast today. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. And I hope to both have you, Patrick, and listeners back at some future episodes. Because I think there is more to talk about.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to chat.
Thank you. That's it for this episode of the Business Emergency Room. If you are currently dealing with chaos or disruption in your business, please reach out. You can email, text, or call, and I will find a way to connect with you within 24 hours. I've helped others steer out of the storm, and I know I can help you too. Talk soon. Please like, subscribe, and share.